globalization and liberalization in developing countries. In this connection, first let us explain a term which is very known to your generation, ICT, Information Communication Technology. This includes the mobile phones, it includes the website, it includes the internet, this includes Facebook, and so on and so forth. Now this is very important aspect of beginning of what is called e-governance. That is, in application of ICT in public administration, the main fundamental objective is to inaugurate e-governance. That is, application of ICT in management process and in reform of administrative structure and in the processes of governance. This ICT has been so important for redrawing and reorganizing the map of functioning of the corporate sector, functioning of the public sector, functioning of the government and people relationship. Government departments now depend a lot on giving information to the people through ICT, and even all public and private corporations and organizations, they have their own website, and in that website they give their objectives, their composition and their functions, so that the people can know what is going on in every corporate sector and public sector organizations. This is quite helpful, and of course as students you know that research scholars to a large extent nowadays depend on ICT, that is internet, in getting data and information for the research work. And this is also very helpful to the NGOs, the social sector, what is called non-profit third sector, so that they can communicate with one another, they can communicate with the government, they can communicate with their clients and the people at large. Now this ICT is so important an aspect of good governance also, because the items included in the good governance shows that ICT has become a very potent instrument, and today nobody can even imagine a smart city or a smart administration, a smart e-governance without ICT. Now e-governance is an aspect of globalization and liberalization, because the information activities, programs, debates and conferences are held almost all over the world through this technique. And in this way the globalization and liberalization process has really got a very important impact on administration, public and private, in any country, particularly in developed and not in an unimportant way in the developing countries also. Particularly in the case of developing countries, it requires a very knowledgeable sector among the citizens, particularly the new generations who communicate with one another and communicate with the private sector, government sector and NGOs through this. And therefore we understand the importance of ICT in administration and also the world of management, decision making in public as well as private sectors. I think this is the time we go into the another aspect of impact of globalization and liberalization on management and administration. I always use these two words because administration basically implies control, but management, quote and unquote, basically implies the process, techniques, research, and actions whereby resources available are used to the maximum benefit. So, how to use the resources available for deriving the maximum outcome, that is the result, that is most important. And herein the private sector and public sector interactions are quite instructive. For example, the latest practices as affected by globalization that we find in most of the countries, both developed and developing, that is in Australia, in New Zealand, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore. These are the developing countries where we find that even the administrators in public bureaucracy, they are required to undergo a training in private sector organizations. Purpose is let the public bureaucrats learn the atmosphere, the milieu within the organization of the private sector, especially how they increase their efficiency, how they manage their work, how they plan, how they execute. And the focus is basically to increase efficiency and increase productivity. It is expected that the governments in the developing countries will pick up the lessons that public bureaucracy, higher bureaucracy, they must be sent for training for some brief period, occasionally in service training as we say, for in the private sector organization, so that they can know how things are going on, things of making good managers in private sector. Now when this information is inducted within the mindset of the public bureaucrats, that is administrators in government departments, now that will automatically improve the standard of efficiency. But the more important point, I think, is public accountability, where the private sector slightly lags behind. I should say slightly in the sense because private sector also is accountable, we know, to judiciary and to media. Because in present time, public sector autonomy, private sector autonomy does not mean that they can go on interpreting the company's law in their own way. They cannot go on having the relations with trade unions in their own way, because either judiciary or media or both will try to exact accountability from them. But the public bureaucracy, the government sector, they are legally bound to be squarely accountable to the public. To the public means first to parliament, second to the judiciary, and third to the public opinion, that is media. So here is a great example where private public management can easily cooperate. In fact, in administrative parlance, secondment, deputation, these are available opportunities for going private sector can be of great help to the government sector or what we call the public bureaucracy. Secondly, the conventional view that public sector organizations, especially industrial and business organization in the public sector, they are less efficient than private sector. But the point to reflect on, in my mind, would be why they are so, or why this perception. The point is that public sector administrators, they are invisibly under political influence. Now this is a factor which is less occurring in developed countries but more frequently occurring in developing countries, Asian countries and African countries everywhere. That if the public sector administrators and managers are given some autonomy, mostly our experience shows that this autonomy of public sector companies or public sector industrial organizations, they are more in writing or law than in actual practice. Whether the ministerial supervision or whether very hidden way there is fear of interference in the management process of public sector organizations. Therefore, here is an example where globalization and liberalization has got some role to play, in the sense that globalization as practiced in countries such as Australia, New Zealand or Canada or Britain or United States to some extent are examples which developing countries can study and can have some lessons from them. I think the third aspect which requires a great deal of explanation and understanding is the relation between globalization and local government. Let me dwell on this point a little bit. First of all, we must understand that originally globalization was advocated on the grounds that it will encourage decentralization. Decentralization of power and resources is one of the principles of good governance. Now, good governance, which is the product of globalization and liberalization, underlines the importance of devolution of power and responsibilities. And formally, as in India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Malaysia, as we find, or some of the developing African countries also, what we find is that this is again more formal but not real. Let me discuss a little bit on Indian experience. The Indian government, or Indian Parliament amended the Constitution, 73rd and 74th Amendment of the Constitution. In 1992, it was enforced in 1994. So, it was claimed at the time of legislation and immediately thereafter that these two amendments has been a historic achievement so far as they have for the first time given a constitutional status to local government in our country like panchayats and municipalities. It is true. But in practice, when it is practiced in real life situations, we find that thanks to globalization, when foreign funds or foreign funded schemes and development projects are coming to central government and from central government to state government, And then some of these development functions like health schemes or education schemes or livelihood guarantee schemes, food security, everything is being devolved, their responsibility and their implementation being devolved to panchayats and municipalities. But what is the actual reality? When it is devolved to these local governing authorities, they are bound, mandated and bound to abide by the directions, modes of implementation, accountability. In every respect, they are bound by the aid giving authorities. That is to say, and they are all coming from through state governments and the local government entities like municipalities and Jila Parishads, Panchayat Samitis, Gram Panchayats. Everybody knows that they are in reality governed or under the thumb of the state government. So where is the real recognition of people's initiative, people imagination, people efforts for local development and local planning? My point is this, that globalization has created the situation and the background, but through the mechanism of devolving power and responsibility and financial grants, in the ultimate analysis we find that these local government entities are slowly dying under the impact of globalization and foreign aid agencies. After this, the aspect which deserves special attention is globalization and human security. You know that human security is a term which has got very vast connotation. Human security means, first of all, security of food, security of dignity, security of self-identity, security to have a honorable place in society, etc. But when we come to the process of realization of the globalization schemes and programs as implemented through the national central government and the state governments, we find that human security is engendered in many of the developing countries, including, I should say, India and more especially in some of the states of India. For example, right to information is a very laudable object of restoring the dignity of the citizens, underlining the fact that citizens have some sort of a fundamental right, as it has been ruled by the Supreme Court of India, that right to know the process of decision making, right to know and have information about data leading to decision making is a part of fundamental rights as guaranteed under Article 19 of our Constitution. But in actual practice we find, as I have said, in some states of India, there is a level of achievement which is not very praiseworthy. Some state information commissions are not properly constituted. In some other states, information commissions, even when properly constituted, do not function adequately to the satisfaction of the information seekers on the plea that they don't have required staff, they don't have required wherewithals to work with. The PIOs, that is public information officers, they are also not well trained and they are not also quite sympathetic with the aspirations of the people. We know that in this connection, the larger question which comes to light is the issue of good governance in actual practice. I have explained before, I am also now understanding that good governance is really a very laudable project. But good governance, as practiced in most of the developing countries till now, is suffering from a major defect, that is, rule of law is not quite satisfactorily maintained. Herein lies the great difference between the standard of public administration or public-private partnership or public sector, private sector functioning in developed countries and developing countries. In developing countries, it is found that good governance basic principles are not always properly protected or not always properly maintained. For example, right to have guaranteed employment is a very high ambitious project, or right to food security, or right to have freedom from violence. So these are domestic violence, etc. Now all these three, which are quite important for realizing the high ideals of good governance, where do the ordinary citizens stand? Do they get this in actual practice? Do they actually enjoy the freedom in its total contextual meaning? Are their minds free? Are their education free? Are their individual initiatives free? Certainly not. So developing countries must take more attention to achieving the basic principles of good governance. Secondly, good governance is quite emphatic on having the weaker sections and the women within the purview of good governance. Now herein also the general experience, which have been well researched during the last 10 years or so in all developing countries, reveal that neither the women have been properly empowered nor the marginalized sections have been properly given the status of a dignified life. Women have got right to reservation in India and Bangladesh. So far as I know, in other countries there may be. But their empowerment, if not even in 1% case, are real empowerment in the sense that they enjoy the power in the reflected glory of their menfolk and under the heavy tutelage of their caste and subcaste, etc. So what is the real empowerment? And so far as the tribals and the marginalized sections, they are also suffering from these inhibitions and limitations. We can conclude this discussion by having a few comments or observations that globalization and liberalization, they are to be of utmost benefit to the developed countries only when there develops a proper political culture and administrative culture. Particularly, I will emphasize the weakness of ethical code. Sometimes we see that law is made to defend ethics in public service, but the law remains in the statute book. When it is implemented, we find that ethical code suffers from neglect. Nobody pays proper attention to the ethics of public administration, to the ethics of proper management for delivering public services or for fortifying the dignity of the human beings, qua human beings. Citizens as individuals have got this basic right, which is generally not encouraging in most of the developing countries. I think globalization and liberalization will be of utmost benefit only when the developing countries learn to build up a proper administrative culture, a proper political culture of toleration and respect to the marginalized individual. That was the message of Gandhiji, that was the message of Abraham Lincoln, that was the message of Subhash Chandra Bose, that was the message of Sri Aurobindo. Wherever we go, or even the Nelson Mandela, wherever we look, we find the same thing and same experience.